What's up, everybody? This is Steven from the Redirect podcast. I've been fooling around with YouTube not all day, for the last little bit, and trying to figure out different ways to do this. I've got the setup, and we finally upgraded our internet. It turns out we were on basically dial-up internet in our office, which is cool. So we got that upgraded, and I'm gonna need to get a new computer if I want to reach my full potential as a YouTube. I don't know. I don't even know if I really want to do that, to be honest. But anyhow, so I got tied up in that, and Matthew called in sick today, and our big guest interview, Charles Cook, friend of the show, he kind of, I hate to call him out like this, but he kind of flaked on me a little bit. He texted me like 3 hours ago saying he needed a little more time. And turns out he hasn't texted back since then. So, that's fine. He's a big, important guy. And really, so we wanted to talk to Charles because he's representing 21 Savage, the rapper who was arrested last week, I believe, and detained by ICE. And I do want to say, if you're going to have a lawyer, an immigration lawyer, you definitely want Charles Cook, former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and all around good dude. And it's not just that he's been practicing for decades, although that helps. We read the other day on the show a brief that I came across from a lawyer who's been also practicing for decades, and it's written, reads like it was written by a third grader. So the mere fact that you've practiced for so long doesn't mean that much. I had read that there were some other lawyers coming in on that case. I think I read that Jay-Z hired a big New York litigating lawyer. I don't know. It's a big fancy lawyer from New York, which is fine. And I certainly wouldn't disparage an attorney who I don't know. What I do know is that immigration law is like this weird sort of niche type of law. And I've seen in court these lawyers who sometimes will come in, and again, not to say that this is the case in this particular case, but they'll come into court and they're wearing a $3,000 suit, and their poor client flew them in from across the globe or across the country, and they get to court and they don't know what an E-28 is. And an E-28 is the form that you have to file for the court to even talk to you. It's your entry of appearance. And I've seen some of these lawyers in immigration court come forward and not know sort of the most rudimentary things that you would need to know if you wanted to practice in the immigration court. And so hopefully this isn't a case where, lawyers who charge thousands of dollars an hour, who I'm sure are very good at certain things but might not know that much about this, are being flown in to sort of, flex on the immigration court. That's not the type of thing that would go over well. You want somebody like Charles, frankly, on the case. So anyways, this is all just speculation. I don't know really what's going on with it. And I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole of sort of speculating about things I know nothing about. Although I guess that's what I do every week. So let's see here. Let's talk real quick about a couple of stories. So last week, a good friend of mine, Nora Phillips, she's an attorney in California. She runs a nonprofit called Al Otro Lado. And I might have mentioned this last week, actually, in the intro, but she flew to Mexico and was detained at the airport by Mexican officials, and then ultimately deported, sent back. Well, I don't know if it's formally a deportation, legally speaking, but she was returned to the United States. And, and there's some very dramatic details. She was separated from her family, from her kids, or from her daughter and her husband, and interrogated over a long period of time. And they were held for hours without, food or water. And the thrust of the work that's done by Al Otro Lado, when I first heard of them, was to help deportees, to screen cases to find, they found many U.S. citizens, for example, who'd been deported because ICE didn't realize they were U.S. citizens, and neither did the client. Maybe people who may have, for example, acquired citizenship by birth abroad under our laws. Sometimes that can happen, if your father is a U.S. citizen and your mother, and they live certain years in the United States or whatever. You could be born in Mexico, but be born a citizen of the United States. And sometimes these people get deported. And so they, looking for those cases, or people who might qualify for other type of relief or waivers or those sorts of things. And it's sort of a, in that capacity, it's a very unique type of nonprofit because, oftentimes deportees they've obviously been deported. They often have some sort of criminal history, and these are looked at oftentimes, I think, by certain people as sort of messy or complicated cases. A lot of people who want to do nonprofit immigration type work, they're looking for those golden clients, the people who have no blemishes. They're, the dreamers who went to medical school and so on and so forth. And they don't really want to touch these other cases. And so Nora deserves a lot of credit for diving right in and getting into that. So anyhow, in the last few years, they've been involved also in helping to coordinate services for people who are in Tijuana seeking asylum. This isn't something that just started in the last few months or even the last year, but in the last several years, they've had huge numbers of people in Tijuana from all over the world seeking asylum. And so they've tried to help as many people as they can present themselves at the border, facilitating communication with CBP, and they even sued CBP because CBP was implementing this sort of lottery system where they only take a certain number of people per day. And so they've been really involved down there since way before this was, sort of a popular thing to do, or before it was on the news. Way before you heard about this issue, Nora was in Mexico, working really hard. And she's the type of person who really cares about the people, and she carries that with her, I think, very deeply, on a very deep level. So, just one of those people that just one of the best people I've met, I guess. And I do consider her a friend. I guess you could ask her what she thinks about me, but, so she was detained and removed. And there's a couple things that are troubling about this. First of all, obviously, it's bad whenever somebody gets put on some sort of nefarious list and you don't really know what's the criteria for getting on the list, or how do you get off of it, or who's on it, or who's running it. And she appears to be on some sort of list along with some other advocates who are also removed in the same way. And so that's obviously a concern. The second thing, I guess, would be that at the same time, this whole Remain in Mexico program, in big giant quotes, because it's very poorly thought out. But essentially what this program is what it's trying to do is to have asylum seekers wait out the processing of their cases in Mexico, rather than coming here and, being productive members of society. Let's keep them in Mexico. And one of the administration's arguments is that they can find a lawyer in Mexico. It's no big deal. There's no real obstacle to, right to counsel, which we know is not true. First of all, we talked about that a few weeks ago, that there's going to be all kinds of obstacles to finding counsel in such a situation. But they're going to have a hard time making that argument if they're also putting they're like 5 immigration lawyers in the entire world who are willing to fly to Mexico and do this work for free, I should add. If those people are being literally deported from Mexico, then the government's going to have a hard time arguing that these asylees or asylum seekers are totally fine waiting it out in Mexico. So, it's a troubling story. I thought it would actually get more attention than it has, and it just sort of hasn't. And so, hopefully we get to the bottom of that. And I guess the other thing I wanted to talk about real quick was the State of the Union. It was really crappy, coming in hot with my Trump sucks takes. Trump is very boring when he's reading, obviously, but it's this touched on the sort of usual immigrant and immigration talking points. And it strikes me not just, it's one thing to disagree on policy. Like, I want 150,000 people allowed in per year, and I want 25,000. And we're going to argue about why we want the numbers we want and why we want the policies we want. And I guess we talked about this last week, but it's frustrating to have an entire conversation happen on this field that is completely wrong. I guess it's not unusual for politics to involve misinformation or misdirection or whatever. That's pretty par for the course. But here it's just so stark and dramatic. So he says that we got to build the wall and stop illegal immigration so we can put the coyotes and the traffickers and the cartels out of business. Well, the problem with that is it's the opposite of reality. So if you go back, 25 or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, if you were a Mexican who wanted to come work in the fields, you basically just crossed the border and maybe tried to avoid, border patrol if they were around. And you went and you worked and you went back to Mexico, and it was not that big of a deal. And you never would have thought about paying a coyote to help you cross, right? Because the borders were fairly open. And this idea that you would pay a coyote, and not just pay a coyote, but the numbers that we're hearing are getting ridiculous, tens of thousands of dollars. The idea that you would pay somebody that much money to get you across is directly a function of what border wall we do have and the increased militarization of the border. So you can't cross easily the way you would have in the 1970s. You've got to hire an expert to cross you through the most dangerous parts of the border, because that's where we've funneled people with the walls that we do have. So the safe areas where people would have crossed 20 or 30 years ago, now there are walls, and there is border patrol, and there is border enforcement. And so the places that are unenforced or less enforced, I guess we should say, are like huge deserts where people die in large unknown numbers. And so that's the reason why people are forced to hire coyotes to cross them illegally. And that's an industry that didn't exist 30 years ago. So the idea that more wall and more enforcement is going to somehow put those people out of business is the opposite. The more wall we have and the more enforcement we have, their numbers are going to go up. That's, tens of thousands of dollars in their pocket. That's going to go to who knows what use at the end of the day. So, it's just stuff like that. Just a clear misunderstanding of basic border principles. Like, talk to any border expert. They could set you straight on this stuff in 5 minutes. He called it an urgent crisis. Well, I've posted this picture on Twitter, but I've got a magazine from 1979. I think it's a U.S. News or U.S. World Report or something like that. And on the cover, there's a couple of Mexican guys being arrested by Border Patrol, and the headline is "Invasion Out of Control?" Question mark. We're just asking questions here. And this is 1979, right? So we think of this as like some sort of modern, brand new problem. It's not. It's not. People have been coming here forever, going back to Christopher Columbus, but and so it's not urgent. The idea that it's urgent is ludicrous. And also the idea that it's some sort of crisis is also ludicrous. I mean, the statistics are clear. These people commit less crimes. They come here to work. They don't have access to our public safety net, our social safety net, which means that if you're undocumented, you don't get food stamps, you don't get welfare, you don't get any of those benefits. You pay into Social Security, but you don't draw on Social Security ever. And so it's, they know that the real arguments go against what they want. Because what they want is essentially xenophobic and white nationalist. And so, it's much harder, although in this country, not impossible, but much harder to sort of animate people to action by just coming straight out and saying, like, we don't want brown people here. Although that would animate some people in a very serious way, I guess. But they also know that there would be backlash. And so we've got to try and sort of like bury it in code and talk about these other things which are totally untrue, and sort of drive the conversation into this fantasy world where people are being taped up with blue electrical tape, and we're going to highlight anecdotal stories of terrible crimes, right, that happen to be committed by people who are undocumented, while ignoring the overall statistics. They have to do that because they don't have good arguments, and there aren't good arguments for racism or xenophobia. And so this is the same playbook as forever. I'm not an expert on Jim Crow or Reconstruction or that era, but I could probably guess that if you went back at that time, you would find the same arguments being made about why we need, strict Jim Crow laws, about curfews for Black people and things like that, or going back to the justifications for slavery in the first place. So anyhow, the State of the Union was a hot mess, as you can imagine. But yeah, we keep plugging along. Hey, I asked for some feedback on what people would like us to do as a show. How can we get better? Some people said we could do the show live on Fridays. That would be nice. I got to get a new computer, like I said, because I just don't have the RAM. But some people said we should finish the show on a good note, share a positive story. And so, yeah, I mean, let's see if I can think of something. One thing as an immigration lawyer, I think, I don't know if it's just me, but I think most immigration lawyers like to get the mail. One of the reasons we like to get the mail is that's where the green cards come, and the work permits, and all of that good stuff that we work so hard to try and get. And this week we got a couple of green cards for people who've been here for dozens of years. And this is one of the crazy things about our laws, is that the people who do end up getting papers, of course they're good people, and of course they've been fingerprinted, and they've had intensive background checks and interviews, of course. But oftentimes they end up getting papers because of some technicality. They have an old petition from a sibling, or somebody petitioned for their parents in the 1990s, and now they're married to a U.S. citizen. And this perfect combination of random facts gets them a green card. It's not like they were measured on their merits against all other immigrants or something like that. It's that, yes, they're good, and yes, they've got clean records and all those things, but they're also extremely lucky. So, anyhow, not to undercut my positive story, but really good family, hardworking, good people. We just got their green card. And, imagine being from Mexico and having come here 20 years ago and knowing that the whole time that you were raising your family here, but you had to kind of do it in the shadows, and you couldn't really go back to Mexico because if you went back, you wouldn't be allowed back in. And you had to wait for this petition to come current that's, 10, 15, 20 years old. And then going from that, if you can put yourself in that mindset, that sort of anxiety-ridden state for a second, and then imagine it all going away, and suddenly you're just fine. You've got a green card. You want to go to Mexico? No problem. You can go, come back. You want to pay your taxes? Sure, no problem. You get pulled over for a ticket? No big deal. You can pay it, and whatever, depending on what the ticket's for, obviously. But it's just such a relief, and I wish that we could bring that to more people. And really, for a lot of people, they stay at the same jobs. Their life doesn't change in any real material way. It's not like, oh, now I'm going to be making $100,000 a year and everything has changed. But I do feel like when I run, because Yakima's a fairly small town. When I run into these people, a year later or 2 years later, I see them at Costco or whatever. Maybe I'm imagining things or projecting or whatever, but they feel different. There is a sort of confidence there, and sort of maybe it's a greater sense of belonging that the community that they've lived in and worked hard to support for many, many years has finally recognized them as something other than, a criminal. And, there's got to be a real psychological impact there. So I'm thinking about one particular client who got his green card this week who, will be feeling that. And I'm happy for him and for his kids and his wife. And so thanks for listening to me ramble here for, 15, 20 minutes. If you like the show, you can become a patron. That'd be great. You can subscribe on iTunes, and hopefully soon we'll be launching, something other than just the podcast. Although, the podcast is fine too. So we appreciate all the support and people who've already pledged or been patrons now for over a year. Thanks for all of your support. Have a good weekend, everybody.